Okay, y'all, so we're starting here on your notes where we are looking at key concept 3.3. Some of your classes may have gotten this far. If so, you can just fast forward on, except for fourth period who's having to watch and having to endure this. Anyway, y'all, one of the problems of our new government was still dealing with the issues with the British, who still had not left the Northwest, as well as the Spanish. Now, remember, the Spanish had been our ally in the Revolution. But as Americans began to cross over the Appalachian Mountains, they began to run into more and more Indians. Now, technically, in the Treaty of Paris, this land had been given to us, but the British all had refused. And I think yesterday I mentioned, or I know I mentioned this to some of y'all's classes, the terrible events that happened recently in Israel, where terrorists from the Gaza Strip area crossed into Israel and massacred about 1,500 people, including a lot of women and children. Now, it's known that they got weapons, most likely from Iran, to do this. So the question is, what do we do about Iran? Do we kind of pretend that's not happening because we don't want a war with Iran? Well, we face the same issue back during this time. We know that the British are getting weapons to the Indians that are being used to kill Americans in the old Northwest Territory. So do we go to war with Great Britain with it? Do we try to talk to Britain about it? What about the Spanish? Now, the Spanish are down there at the base of the Mississippi River, what is today New Orleans and was then, and they're not letting us trade there. So what do we do about this? So that's on your notes. Make sure you guys have that. Now, from what I understand on my notes, but it's here, but on your notes, it's not. So you guys don't really have this particular statement on there. So anyway, y'all can just go ahead and skip through that, and I'll leave that out. So problems with Great Britain. Now, one of the things we did not talk about when I was going over the results for different minorities of the American Revolution, I kind of saved talking about what happened to the Indians for this moment. But a lot of what I'm going to talk about here kind of goes back to the Revolution. Now, it's important to understand, y'all, that during the American Revolution, most Indians sided with the British. Remember, they had sided with the French in the French-Indian War. They sided with the British in the American Revolution. So find that spot that says problems with Britain. Now, when the war was over, the Iroquois Confederation of 6 nations was left kind of divided. Some people will claim the Iroquois never really completely recovered. The Indians, y'all, were required in the Treaty of Paris to give up massive, massive amounts of land, okay? Now, the British, even though they were told by the Treaty of Paris to evacuate, to leave these forts in what is today the Northwest, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, they refused to remove their forts, or they refused to evacuate. Why? Once again, going way back to the beginning of this year when we talked about the fur trade, that's still a big deal. So the British, y'all, did not want to lose that fur trade with the Indians. So they kept soldiers there. Also, y'all, the British were fearful of America kind of growing, okay? They wanted to keep us bottled up, kind of like they had with the Proclamation of 1763. If America kept growing, America might someday be a big threat to the British. So they wanted to keep us bottled up. Now, one of the things the Indians, or the British, were doing with the Indians, like I said, kind of like we believe Iran is doing with the Hamas people in the Gaza Strip, is they were furnishing them weapons. Now, this will continue to be a problem, y'all, and help lead. It'll be one of the many causes of the War of 1812 that we'll talk about probably at the end of next week. So these Indians, y'all, are called Miami Indians. Now, I know when you and I think of Miami, we think Florida, right? It's one of my favorite places to go. My wife and I love Miami. But this is Miami, Ohio. There's even a university up there, and you have to kind of, I've seen students that are like, I'm going to the University of Miami, Mr. D. I'm like, that's awesome. And they said, yeah, but it's not in Miami, Florida. It's in Miami, Ohio. I'm like, well, hey, that's a nice place too, but make sure you guys know which Miami you're going to. So this was the so-called Miami Indian Confederacy. Now, the Indian you see here in the picture on your notes, as well as up on here, his name was Little Turtle because, well, he kind of had a head that looked kind of like a turtle there, right? And I guess he was little, so hence his name. Now, Indians under Little Turtle, y'all, had two groups of soldiers come out there and try to attack him because he'd been attacking American settlers. So we sent the army to kind of clear him out. He defeated him. 600 American soldiers were killed. Now, if you want to base that on population that we have today, man, y'all, that would be like 100,000 American soldiers being killed as far as population goes. Because our population was a handful of million people. We got 330 million people today. 600 American soldiers, y'all. We never, ever, even Custer, when Custer gets defeated in 1876 at Little Bighorn, we had never, ever, and would never, ever lose so many of our soldiers to them. That's like a really, really bad day in American history. And he only lost 40 men. So this is the worst defeat by Indians, worst defeat by Indians on Americans ever, right? Now, what tends to happen with Indians, and maybe you guys have begun to pick up this pattern as we've made our way through American history. The Indians, y'all, oftentimes took us in, by us, I mean Americans, Anglo-Americans. But what would begin to happen is pretty soon they realized, hey, this isn't good for us. But they were very disunited. Indians fought each other, and it was hard for the Indians to ever unite against a common enemy. But occasionally they would, as in King Philip's War in Massachusetts, or when the Indians attacked in Jamestown. But the thing that happens, y'all, is when they do that, yeah, they win a victory, but almost immediately it then causes all the Europeans, or in this case English and Americans, to unite to wipe them out once and for all. The same thing will happen in the 1870s when I mentioned that Custer's Last Stand. People were kind of saying, hey, maybe we should work with the Indians. They did lose their land and all of this. But when that happens, y'all, and the Indians attack, those people who were trying to say, let's see it from the Indians' point of view, forget it. Nobody's going to listen to them. So as a result of this victory over these 600 dead Americans, y'all, the United States under President Washington decided for once and for all, we're going to take care of Little Turtle and his Miami Indians, okay? All right. Now, okay. So what happens? What ends up happening, y'all, is the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Now, this is obviously 10 years after the Treaty of Paris. But we send a general to defeat Little Turtle and the Miami Indians. His nickname is Mad. Now, anytime a guy's nickname is Mad, you know you're in for a lot of, well, a bad time. Mad Anthony marches out there, and we're not going to get into all the details, but Mad Anthony goes out and he defeats the Miami Confederation. And once again, as they will do later on, the British, seeing the Americans coming, seeing the Miami Indians being defeated so badly, they abandoned the Indians and they let them go. Now, out of force, and this is the way these things usually work, the Indians are forced to sign a treaty. The treaty that results from the Battle of Fallen Timbers is known as the Treaty of Greenville. And basically, what is today Indiana, what is today Ohio, that land was all lost. They gave up every bit of it, except they did supposedly have the right to still hunt on the land. So you see a little picture down there, although I'm kind of blocking it in the picture. You see a picture of the Indians meeting with the folks to do that. Now, never on an AP test, but I just kind of like to tell you this little story. Mad Anthony ultimately died out there in the Northwest. You can kind of see where he was way over here when he passed away. Now, it took a little while to get ready to take his body back, and by the time it was ready to take the general back, they decided to just kind of melt down the flesh and leave only the bones. And so what they did, y'all, was they kind of boiled his body, and then the bones were left behind. They put the bones on a wagon in a big box, but apparently, y'all, somebody forgot to lock the box, or somehow the box came open. So as they took him back on a bumpy road, y'all, Mad Anthony's bones began to fall out. And by the time they arrived all the way back to the coast here, there wasn't much left of Mad Anthony. And to this day, on certain nights, when you're traveling, people will see Mad Anthony roaming this road, trying to find his bones. Ooh. Scary stuff, kids. All right, so there's your story of Mad Anthony. That would never be on a B test, but I think it's dadgum interesting. All right, so I included on y'all's notes here a picture of the Indian land cession. Cession, of course, means, in this case, giving up land. If you look here in the yellow area, you guys can see this was the land that the Indians gave up even before the American Revolution in 1768, okay? Then land that was given up during the Revolution and after the Revolution is this area in green. So that's more land that was lost, and a little bit down here in South Carolina. Now, in the years after the war, what we just talked about, here you see Grenville. Now, this is where the Battle of Fallen Timbers took place, where Mad Anthony Wayne defeated Little Turtle. Grenville is where the treaty was made. And this area, kind of in the cool teal, blue-greenish sort of color, that's my wife's favorite color, that land was all ceded. Now, this land here, okay, some of it being Indiana and Illinois, was still unceded. But the thing is, y'all, there were still some British forts. Here we see Fort Miami was still left there. And then you notice down here, y'all, this is Spanish Florida. This is supposed to be Spanish, but if you notice here, you see Fort Natchez, now the city of Natchez, beautiful city on the Mississippi. Fort Nogales, Fort San Fernando. You see those various forts that are technically in our land. I mean, imagine having another country's fort. What if Mexico, what if Canada had a major fort, y'all, right in the middle of the United States? You and I would not like that. So that's going to cause some real problems as well. Okay? Now, all right, let's go to Jay's Treaty. That'll be the next thing to talk about here. Now, John Jay, who was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, he only wrote like 3 or 4. He apparently got sick. He got some other job, probably to go over, well, no, it was too soon to go over and negotiate this treaty. But he was our first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But he was sent to London to negotiate sort of a settling of these problems with Britain. You know, you're aiding the Indians, you're selling weapons or giving weapons to the Indians. You're stopping American ships and sometimes seizing American ships that we're sending to France. We don't want to go to war. Let's work something out. So John Jay gets sent to Britain to deal with this. Now, the Republicans, that is the Democratic Republicans, so you guys don't get confused with the Republicans that come later, they're very, very unhappy with, it's a Federalist going, and particularly with what happens with this treaty. Now, in this treaty, the British make a lot of promises. Sad thing is, y'all, they're not really going to honor any of those promises. One of the promises he got the British to promise was that they would get rid of those forts. They would remove those forts and evacuate those soldiers in American territory. Well, guess what? They don't do it. And they won't, y'all, until we fight the War of 1812, 16, 18 years later. The next thing is, y'all, the British did agree to pay for ships that they had taken from America that were on their way to France. But they don't promise, they don't say that they'll pay for others. and they don't promise to stop seizing ships. So it's like, yeah, we'll pay for the ships that we've already taken, but we're not promising you we're going to not take other ships. So, yeah, we're going to probably keep taking your American ships. Now, this is also going to be a big problem y'all need to keep in mind for another week and a half or so, and this is what is known as impressment. You see that word right here, impressment. Now, if I said I'm going to impress y'all, you're like, hey, Mr. D, you impress us every day, right? But we don't mean impress like, whoa, that is so awesome, man, you really impressed me, Mr. D. I didn't know you could do the splits and put your legs around your head. I used to be able to do that, by the way, and y'all would have been impressed. But no, that's not what we're talking about by impressment. Impressment, y'all, means I find you on an American ship. I say, you know what? You're coming with me. You're going to work on my British ship. In other words, impressment, y'all, means making you serve in somebody else's military. In this case, it was in the Navy. And pretty much, y'all, more than anything, that's going to be one of the causes that leads to the War of 1812, obviously a few years later, impressment. And by the way, y'all, as I will reiterate when I talk about the War of 1812, you did not want to be in the British Navy. For one thing, they didn't feed soldiers very well. You got no fresh fruit or anything. And British soldiers suffered from scurvy and rickets. Their bones and everything would all get twisted up. And finally, y'all, they had to start giving limes to the British soldiers. Limes are a source of vitamin C. And by British soldiers sucking on a lime during the day, it gave them enough vitamin C that they wouldn't get sick. And to this day, and it's not a nice term, I mean, it's not as bad as some words that people use to describe different ethnicities, but you will still hear some Americans call British people limeys because they sucked on limes. But also, y'all, the British tended to use whips on their sailors for the most minor of offenses. And these whips, y'all, had little pieces of metal on them. They were called cat o' nine tails. It had 9 pieces with little pieces of metal on it. So when it would hit your back, it didn't just, kind of slice you. It gouged out pieces of flesh. It was awful. So that's why, y'all, for some reason, people didn't want to join the British Navy voluntarily. I don't know why. It sounds like a fun group to be in. So that's why they were stealing American sailors. So the British, y'all, make a lot of promises. Yeah, we promised to pay you for the ships we took, but we're not stopping taking ships. Yeah, we promised to not, we promised to remove our forts, but they didn't. But America, though, we had to pay off the debts that we owed the British from before the war. If you guys remember, one of the parts of the Treaty of Paris was we would pay the British back for all their debt, for all the money we owed them. But we hadn't done it. So this is an awful treaty. A lot of promises, but no guarantee. And Americans are having to pay this money back. Now, this treaty accomplishes virtually nothing, okay? However, in a way, it's going to lead to another treaty that will be known as Pinckney's Treaty that we'll talk about here in just a sec. Now, furor, in other words, anger, right? Anger over Jay's treaty, y'all. So, what happens? Well, the Washington, when Jay comes back with the treaty, you got to remember this takes like about 5 to 6 weeks. Jay shows up with the treaty. Washington reviews it, and he's like, holy you know what? This is awful. We're paying them money, and they're promising to do stuff, and they probably won't do it. This is awful. Now, one of the things you guys need to make sure you understand, especially for when we talk about World War I, second semester, is a peace treaty, y'all. Presidents can make peace treaties, but treaties don't go into effect until the Senate approves. And not only does the Senate have to approve, y'all, the treaty with a vote, it has to be 2/3 of the Senate according to the Constitution. So you have to get both parties, y'all, to agree to a treaty. A handful of people can say no to a treaty. So Washington, y'all, was really, really embarrassed. I mean, he was kind of like a kid. You know, he shows up, he's got the treaty. He takes the treaty to Congress, and he's like, here's the treaty. Y'all go ahead and vote on it, right? Vote yes, it's a good treaty. Trust me. And the Congress people are like, Mr. President, we respect you and all, you know, General Washington, but we kind of like to read the treaty before we agree to it. Washington's like, no, it's good. Go ahead, just sign it right now. And it really damaged his reputation. I think personally, a lot of them, and that included even some Republicans, went ahead and voted for the treaty so it would pass, but they kind of did it as a favor to Washington. Sort of like, all right, it's the old man. He won the revolution. Yeah, the treaty sucks, but yeah, whatever. Let's just go ahead and vote for it. So the treaty passed. Now, word leaks out about how bad this treaty is to the American people. Southerners, y'all, particularly threw a fit. And if you remember, the Southerners tended to be part of the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson's, Madison's party. So what does it look like? They're going to have to pay their debts back, right, because they owed a lot of money, while the Northerners who have the votes, they're going to get compensated for their losses, okay? Now, there was a popular phrase that swept the country. Your chance to write a dirty word, right? And basically, this is what people began to chant. Damn Jay, you know, John Jay, the guy who did the treaty. Damn Jay's treaty. And damn anybody who won't damn Jay's treaty. That's how much they hated it. And John Jay himself, he once said, y'all, that he could have walked from Maine down to Spanish Florida by the light of his own effigy burning. Now, an effigy, remember, is when they get some clothes and then they stuff hay in it, and then they put a piece of paper label on it of the person that you would like to burn, but you can't really burn people because that's like bad against the law. But it's like saying, you know, Jay, we hate you so much. We would burn you if you could, but we can't. So we're burning this as an example. And he said there were so many people burning effigies of him that that's what he would do. Okay? Pinckney's Treaty is important to know. I like to give you guys French words, right? Because you just sound smarter if you use French. And it's a lovely language. I've spent a lot of my life trying to learn it, and I'm still not very good at it. I can speak it, I can read it, but I sure as heck can't understand it. So anyway, Spain, when they heard about Jay's treaty, were worried that maybe the British and Americans were getting back together. After all, this is such a positive, treaty for the British. What the heck's going on with Americans? What they worried about is what we in diplomacy call a rapprochement. In other words, a rapprochement. We were coming back together, a rapprochement with Britain. And so basically, the Spanish negotiated a treaty with a man by the name of Pinckney. Pinckney later will run for president, largely on the success of this. He'll lose, but he became a very popular person. Now, Spain wants to get in our good graces. What this treaty does, y'all, is it very carefully defined what was West Florida, shown here, that Spanish West Florida, and what would be America now. Shown here in this kind of yellow, this is what the Spanish were claiming, in addition to this area down here. What they're going to end up doing, y'all, is basically ending Florida kind of over by here, kind of modern-day Pensacola, and they're going to give us what becomes the bottom part of Alabama. You got Mobile. I used to live over here as a kid. I lived over between Mobile and Biloxi. And then Biloxi here is the modern day part of Mississippi. So they give us that. That's pretty generous. They also give up this claim up here. as well too. Another thing that they did is, if you remember, the Spanish had been threatening our rights of navigation, our right to go down the Mississippi River all the way down here to Baton Rouge and all the way to Nouvelle Orleans, or as we say, Nolens in America. So anyway, they give us that. So what this does, y'all, it settles what has gone down in history as the West Florida controversy. And it comes out to a very sweetheart deal. Now, unfortunately for us, or maybe fortunately, I don't know, the Spanish are going to have Louisiana taken away from them by the French. Napoleon puts his brother-in-law or brother or whatever on the throne and takes it away. It'll be the French that sell us Louisiana Territory in 1803. Maybe the Spanish would have, I don't know. So Pinckney's treaty is about the only good thing that comes out of the Jay Treaty, but it's indirectly. And what it did do is it settled our problems with Spain. And yeah, maybe it sets us on the path where we will buy Louisiana and not really have any more issues with the French either. Okay? Oops. All righty. Let me go to the next slide here. All right. Prove y'all, Washington's popularity completely tumbles. Now, the last thing to mention here before y'all go to lunch, Washington is starting to get kind of senile. It's obvious he's forgetting stuff. Washington decides to retire after 2 terms, what is 8 years. Now, from this point on, this is going to establish a tradition, what is known as the 2-term limit, the 2-term tradition. This will not be broken until Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, gets reelected for a 3rd time in 1940. Now, World War II was raging in Europe. We were in the midst of a Great Depression, and he thought he was so important, so valuable, that he couldn't step down. If that's not bad enough, when we're into World War II, and the war's coming to kind of closing, FDR ran for a 4th term. Had he lived, y'all, FDR would have been president for 16 years. Imagine, you guys could have started 1st grade, gone all the way through high school, went to college, and graduated from college, and have had the same president the whole time. Now, fortunately, though, he did the decent thing and got sick and died in April 1945. And so we didn't have to wear that. Now, as a result, in the 1950s, we made an amendment to the Constitution. It's called the 22nd Amendment. It's easy to remember because you get 2 terms, 22nd Amendment. A president can serve a maximum of 8 years, but you can be president for long as 10. Now, obviously, we wouldn't want anything bad to happen to our president we have now, but if something did happen, let's say, because Biden is more than halfway through, he's more than halfway through his term. If something were to happen and Kamala Harris took over, Kamala could serve the rest of this term of Biden, and then she could also get elected to 2 terms herself. She could be president for essentially up to 10 years. All right, we'll go out here. All right, we're almost finishing up Washington. I know it's been a long time. Is Washington's farewell address. Now, this is specifically mentioned in your AP Key Concepts. So it's very, very important that you guys understand this and be able to talk about it. Now, Washington cautioned or warned us about political factions. Now, I've talked about factions, which in my mind are sort of temporary groupings of people who agree on a single issue. What he was really warning us is what he called the baneful spirit of the party. He was worried that parties might tear us apart. And, you know, kind of when you look at what's happening in America now, I hate to say, he might have had something to it. The other warning that AP specifically mentions about, y'all, is the dangers of permanent foreign alliances. Now, a lot of smart people, as I've said before, often know and say, well, you know, George Washington warned us not to have any alliances. That is not true. Washington understood that temporary alliances, you know, with a set period that they begin and end, are sometimes necessary. But he didn't want to have happen what had happened with France when we made a permanent alliance. Things change. Countries that are your friend 1 year in a decade can be your enemies. I hate to say that, but that's the way it is. Washington realized that. And I'm also going to mention some of the other things that Washington talked about as well. Now, you see a little bit of the cartoon here, and it says, "It is our true policy to stay clear of permanent alliance." Notice that, permanent alliance with any portion of the foreign world, as far as we know, liberty to do it. Let me not be understood or capable of patronizing infidelity to existing engagements. In other words, I'm not going to be able to, I'm not going to let this damage any current agreements. And indeed, it would be Adams, y'all, that would have to get us out of that permanent alliance with France. He, of course, wanted us to continue neutrality. Another thing that he's going to do as we go through this, and I'll mention here, is he warned us about getting involved in European wars. Now, normally when we talk about an address, as in President Eisenhower's farewell address in 1961, it's a spoken address. This, y'all, was not spoken, but it was written and published in the newspapers. Most people believed Alexander Hamilton wrote it. There might have been some suggestions or things added by James Madison, who was, of course, Hamilton's opponent by this point. Now, I go ahead and okay. All right, so the election in 1796, Washington's out, right? Who could possibly replace George Washington? It's sort of like, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the great musician Jimi Hendrix, right? Amazing guitarist. No one wanted to play after Jimi Hendrix. Why? Because he was great. Would you possibly look nearly as good as Jimi Hendrix afterwards? No. So who wants to follow Washington? So could anybody really replace George Washington? Now remember, the way it was originally set up is that each elector would be given 2 votes. 1 vote had to be from somebody outside of your state. The person who got the most votes becomes president. The person who gets the second most votes will become vice president. The question I often ask then is, you guys, are you smarter than our founding fathers? Can you see any potential problems in having the person with the most votes president and the person with the second most votes as vice president? What's the potential problem? They're not going to agree with each other. As I've said before, imagine Hillary as vice president, Trump as president. Biden as president, Trump as vice president. They disagree, but remember, they did not think there'd be political parties, and they really thought these people would act on the best behalf of the country, on what's best for the country. It's going to be just the opposite here. Okay, it's sad to see what happens. Now, there are 3 major candidates in 1796. There's John Adams, who had been the vice president for 8 long years under George Washington. Obviously, very talented, if kind of a unpleasant man. There's, of course, Thomas Jefferson, former Secretary of State. He had resigned, right, so he could run for president. He had been our ambassador to France. He'd been the author of the Declaration of Independence. He and Adams, ironically, y'all, had been really good friends. But because of politics and their different views on how the world should work, or America should work, they had become political enemies, and their friendship was over. Okay? Now, the third guy was Pinckney. Pinckney of Pinckney's Treaty fame. He was from South Carolina. So those are the 3 major people who were going to run in 1796. Okay, now, what were the results? And this is a somewhat complex looking chart. You guys can just kind of look at it there at home or here. When it's all said and done, John Adams got 71 of the electoral votes. Thomas Jefferson got 68 of the electoral votes. Just 3 electoral votes separate him. And even Pinckney, y'all, he finished with a nice 59. Aaron Burr, of whom you will hear more in 1800 and 1804, Aaron Burr gets 30. Now, this meant, y'all, that Adams had a majority, because remember, you get to vote twice. Adams had a majority of the electoral votes and had the most. Adams would become president. Okay, even Sam Adams got 15 votes, and that's pretty much the last we hear of him. He can go back to malting beer, making the stuff to make beer. Jefferson gets 68, so Jefferson's going to become vice president. Now, I've mentioned to y'all before that one of the things that happens in these elections is these are what we call regional elections, or regional parties. Jefferson's Federalist Party, y'all, is very concentrated up here in red, okay, or this pinkish color. He wins all of the Northeast, including New York, New Jersey, and part of Pennsylvania. Remember also, y'all, the Federalists were very popular along the coast. Jefferson, on the other hand, man who represents the farmers, Jefferson wins the West. He wins the South, okay? Now, so here you see the results again, right? Adams gets enough to get a majority. Jefferson gets enough to finish second place. And you can see there were other people in there as well. All right. All righty, y'all. So what we're going to be getting to look at today will be the Adams administration. Now, I put John Adams because, of course, he will have a son. That's John Quincy Adams, who will become president as well, too. Okay. We put this back up here. I don't know why my little camera disappeared, but anyway, maybe it's working now. I don't know. Okay, aim this more here. Okay, so we're going to begin looking at John Adams here, y'all. He's only president for 4 years, but there are a few things you guys need to make sure that you guys know and that you have. So, he's president from 1797 to 1801 to March of 1801. That's only 4 years. He only gets one administration. Thing coming up on there. Okay, so the Adams presidency, y'all. First of all, it's mainly going to be concerned with foreign affairs, things overseas. Once again, we're still having that trouble with the British and the French, right? The British are seizing our ships and stopping our ships. The French, same thing, because they don't like them go to the others. There's also going to be the XYZ affair, which I'll talk about here in a little bit more detail with you guys. 3 diplomats are going to be sent to France, and the French are going to demand a bribe. They're going to demand a bribe before they even see us, which is kind of embarrassing. You don't do that to a legit country. And then, of course, we're going to have this hysteria. Many Americans are going to want war with France. I mean, how hard could it be? It's France, right? We're going to have a quasi-war with France. By quasi or quasi, we mean it's not an official war. It's not actually declared. And I'll talk about that here in a little bit. And then finally, of course, when Napoleon takes over and Adams sends somebody over there, another group of ambassadors, it works out and we get out of that treaty with them, okay? But we will end up going to war with Great Britain just a few years later. Okay, so the XYZ affair. I don't know if you guys know the phrase XYZ. That means when you say that, it means your zipper is down, okay? That the zipper had not been invented. The zipper, by the way, is a relatively new thing. I think it comes around not until like World War II or something. Now, Adams sends a delegation of Americans, that is a group of ambassadors or negotiators, to try to deal with the seizing of these American ships and that kind of thing, right? So he sends over some people to negotiate. Plus, he's hoping to get out of that treaty, okay? Now, the French, their names aren't released, at least early on. Later, I mean, today we know their names. So in the newspaper, since we didn't know their names, we called them Monsieur X, Monsieur Y, and Monsieur Z, okay? Now, they wanted $250,000 and a loan to the new French government. Remember, the French government was broke after their revolution, after their war, after helping us. They wanted $250,000 and a loan before they would even begin negotiations with us. Now, the phrase that comes out, Americans start chanting, millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. In other words, we'll spend millions of dollars to be able to fight the French and defend ourselves against the French, but we're not going to give them tribute. Remember, tribute, y'all, is what you give a country that's more powerful than you. Like, for example, under the Roman Empire, a lot of their colonies had to pay tribute. They had to give them money, or they would come and get them. The Aztecs, for example, they took tribute from a lot of their other Indian neighbors, which was one reason the Aztecs were so unpopular. Now, most Americans, Hamilton, everybody wanted war with France. They wanted war with France. Why? Well, it's France. It's kind of fun to beat up on France. But the main thing is they wanted the colonial possessions of the French, particularly the Louisiana Purchase, right? Or not Purchase. It was called the Louisiana Territory. Later it'll be the Purchase. They wanted the Louisiana Territory. So a lot of people were hoping that this would be just the perfect opportunity to go to war with France and to get this territory. So this was kind of a scary thing. You know, are we really going to go to war with the country that helped us just 20 years before, right? You know, who joined us in 1777 after the Battle of Saratoga? It looked like we might. Now, Adams, y'all, knew that we were not ready to fight, right? Just like Hamilton knew, we were not ready to fight even France. And there was a lot of pressure, you know, popular pressure put on Adams to go ahead and to give in, okay? To give in and to go to war. Just like there would be in 1898, y'all, there'd be a lot of pressure on President McKinley for us to go to war against Spain. And indeed, McKinley gave in, and he went to Congress, and he asked for a declaration of war. Adams could have done that. It probably would have ensured his reelection, because, you know, presidents, y'all, are usually pretty popular when you go into a war. They're not so popular when the war drags on and people are dying. But, you know, initially, like, oh, a war president, that's great. Sure, let's support him. If he had, he probably would have reassured his election. But instead, Adams keeps his cool. The other diplomats come back. He sends another delegation there, and eventually that delegation gets out of the 1778 treaty with the French. Remember, that was the first treaty we ever made. It was a permanent alliance, which was a big mistake. Sadly for Adams, y'all, he wins the peace, but it's too late for the 1800 election. So the election's in November, y'all. Word gets back, I think, in December 1800 or January 1801 that he had negotiated a deal, which also would have made him popular. So he gets hurt both ways. He could have made the peace, gotten us out of the peace treaty, which would have made him really popular, or he could have gone to war. Neither, I mean, he does get us out of the peace treaty, but the news does not come in time, y'all. And so it's too late for him, and it's too late for his presidency. All right, this quasi-war, just want to give you guys a little bit more detail here. Remember, we had made a deal, the Jay Treaty. The Jay Treaty, which I talk about in the earlier video here, the French got really nervous, just like the Spanish got nervous. Like, man, Americans made such a good deal with the the British, are they becoming friends with the British again? So the French, y'all, start seizing American ships, not just stopping them and searching them, y'all, but actually taking American ships. 300 ships had been taken by mid-1797. That's just a few months into Adams's term. And here you see some of the ships, like this, the French. Forgot about that sound effect there. Okay, got to wake you up and me up. So you see a fight here between an American ship, the Constellation, and the Insurgente. Okay, that sounds more Spanish than French, but whatever. Now, Adams wants to keep us out of the war. Why? Because we're not prepared for it. Okay, we're just not prepared for it. So remember, this happens before that treaty, right? So I know it's kind of confusing the way I have this. We're still under the treaty. He hasn't gotten us out of it yet. Okay. Now, what he does create, and this is referenced in the Hamilton song, that Adams created the Navy and he created the Marine Corps. I think they even mentioned the Coast Guard or something in one of the songs. So he does create a Navy for us. He does create a Marine Corps for us during the buildup to be tough, right? Because as you'll see with President Reagan, the idea was, strength. Build up the military and people won't mess with you, all right? And there's the Marine Corps. Anyway, supposed to have music, but it didn't play. Now, the U.S. captures about 80 French ships in retaliation. So this is a war. It's just not declared, y'all. So just something to kind of know that we had a war with France that was never declared, and it was a war at sea, a quasi-naval war, okay? Now, the worst part that Adams gets is what's known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. I apologize for the size of that, kind of small. But in 1798, y'all, in what we call the midterms, that is the non-presidential election, he'd been elected in 1796. Now it's 1798. The Federalists take control of both houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Now, the thing is, the Federalists, y'all, they're kind of nervous about, well, what's going to happen in 1800? What's going to happen in 1804? They want to try to make their power permanent. So they pass these acts, which are really kind of shocking today. These are called the Alien and Sedition Acts. There's actually two different ones. First of all, the Alien Act, y'all, had nothing to do with Alien, right? The movie Alien. It has to do more with aliens in the sense of immigrants. Immigrants are called aliens, right? There's legal and there's illegal ones who come here. The Alien Act, y'all, increased the time it took to become a citizen from the 5 years it is now and the 5 years it was before this act to 14. And you got to remember, y'all, lifespans were a lot shorter than they are now. Many people died age 40 or 50 or so. So 14 years. That's pretty bad. Now, why would they do such a thing? Well, such as they had data in those days, the data told them that the immigrants tended to vote for Jefferson's party. So, if immigrants could become citizens more quickly in 5 years, they would be voting against the Federalists. So, make it hard for immigrants to become citizens, and you can maybe, keep the Federalists in power. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So this was done to delay immigrants, like we said, who favored the Republicans from gaining the vote. All right, this was done to keep immigrants from getting the vote, or at least delaying it from getting the vote. Now, another part of it, y'all, made it possible to deport dangerous foreigners in peacetime, so-called dangerous foreigners. The thing is, what is a dangerous foreigner? Well, maybe if they were too sympathetic to the British or too sympathetic to the French. What if they're out there protesting? What if they're like this Citizen Genet guy that's talked about in an earlier slide, who tried to encourage people to join the French army, join the French Navy? So, you're protesting the United States, that kind of thing. They could be deported in peacetime, and we could even imprison them if we were in wartime. So if these people are saying negative things about us, if they're protesting our our government or the protesting the Federalists, we can lock them up and we can even send them back home to where they came from. Now that's the Alien Act, right? Okay, the next part is the Sedition Act. Now sedition is when you criticize the government, right? It's where you say some pretty negative things. It's not quite to the level of trying to overthrow, but it can approach that. So what it said was it's illegal to write false, scandalous, or malicious writing. Now, malicious just means mean, y'all. Doesn't mean it's not true. I mean, I could see, hey, we don't want people to write false stuff, but anything scandalous stuff can be true, okay? Malicious, mean stuff can be true. If you wrote about the president, that is Adams, if you wrote about the Congress, which was Federalist, you could actually go to jail. You could get a fine, which several people were fined. You could even be imprisoned. And in 10 cases, y'all, people literally went to jail. Now, this is seen as probably the darkest moment of Adams' presidency. His wife, Abigail, said, John, don't do this. John didn't really want to do it, but he felt some pressure and went ahead and did it. Okay, so the results of the Alien and Sedition Acts. This is probably more important than the acts themselves. First of all, you and I today recognize this as an attack on freedom of press, freedom of speech. This would never, ever pass the Supreme Court today. But this is before the Supreme Court discovered its power that you guys will learn about in 1803 called judicial review, where they can shoot down a law that's unconstitutional. So this was very shocking. So what Jefferson and Madison do, remember, Jefferson is the vice president under this president, right? Madison is still in Congress at this point. They come up with, respectively, the Kentucky Resolution and the Virginia Resolution. Now, what they said here in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, they come up with this theory. They say, look, the U.S. under the Constitution is what we call a compact. It's not necessarily just one country. It's actually a creation of a bunch of independent kind of countries, sovereign states. And each state had a right to nullify, that is to negate, to say no to a law when they felt that the federal government went beyond its powers. So if I'm some state and I don't like something the federal government does, because maybe it impacts me particularly heavily, particularly negatively, I can say, no, you can't do that. Now, I understand why they might think this, but this is going to open up a big, big can of worms, y'all. They hope that other states would follow the lead, and the other states, Virginia and Kentucky, would follow Virginia and Kentucky's lead, y'all, but no other states joined them. The other states just went ahead and let the Alien and Sedition Acts roll. So why is that a big deal? Well, for the Alien and Sedition Acts, it's not for themselves, right? The acts expire, the prisoners get pardoned by Jefferson. So, yeah, some people went to jail, some people paid money, and that was awful. But that's not why the Alien and Sedition Acts are important, y'all. They're important because later on, this is going to become the basis for the states' rights argument. You guys will see when we talk about Andrew Jackson that under Andrew Jackson, South Carolina tried to declare null a couple of tariffs that were passed. And ultimately, y'all, when the southern states decide to leave the Union, that's exactly what they're going to use. We don't like these new laws that we think Lincoln is going to pass. We are going to negate them, and we are going to actually leave the Union, okay? So this becomes the basis for states' rights. When we're going through the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, and the federal law and the Supreme Court is telling southern states, hey, you got to desegregate your schools. You got to desegregate buildings. You can't have blacks and whites being separated. Southern states will use Jefferson's and Madison's theory of being able to declare laws null and void, okay? So this really opened up, y'all, some can of worms. Now, in 1800, we have an election. We'll get into who won and how that I saved that. It's called the Revolution of 1800. It's going to be Jefferson running again against Adams, okay? But what Jefferson is going to do this time is he's going to tell the electors, if you want me as president, don't just vote for me as president. Use one electoral vote for me. Use your other electoral vote from this New York guy called Aaron Burr. We got to keep Adams from finishing second, because if he finishes second, he's going to be my vice president. Now, Jefferson and Burr tie for the presidency. Jefferson eventually wins, and Burr becomes vice president. Now, one of the things I just realized now I forgot to talk to y'all about was the deal that Adams offered with Jefferson. Maybe I can come back to that. So why is this called a revolution when Adams steps down and Jefferson becomes president? Well, because in most countries, y'all, you don't have a peaceful transition. You don't have this peaceful transfer. It's kind of normal today. And, you know, regardless of how you guys feel about what happened on January 6th in this country, I know there are opinions that vary and things, but, you know, that was how it used to kind of be, y'all. People that used to disagree with elections, and they refused to step down. They refused to turn it over. So what happened on January 6th was very much like what we expected might happen in 1800, but it didn't. Adams, even though he was really angry and he split town, y'all, and he refused to stay and shake hands with Jefferson, he still turned it over to him. Now, in 1801, y'all, the Federalist Congress passed an act. Now, remember, Adams doesn't leave office until March. So in January, February, Congress passed this new Judiciary Act. It created a bunch of new judges. Adams, being president, got to pick a bunch of federal judges. So it's like, it would be like today, y'all, when Trump was leaving, if he picked a ton of Republicans that would be in there permanently so that Biden would have to deal with them, or let's say Biden's leaving, and as he gets ready to leave, he names a bunch of judges that are Democrats to make life miserable for whatever Republican may come after him. So it was a way, and we call these, because they were appointed in the last days of office, we call these midnight judges, okay? Even though they weren't really appointed at midnight, his last night, they are appointed in the last days. So these midnight judges were federal judges. Judges serve for life, y'all, and the most infamous of them would be John Marshall. Now, so you've got a new Democratic-Republican president coming in, Jefferson, and Jefferson has to deal with all these judges, including one of whom is John Marshall, his cousin, whose guts he hates, a judge that's going to make his life miserable. So what you can say is, y'all, we're heading for a showdown. So we were heading for a showdown, y'all. All right. So Jefferson believed that the Federalists, y'all, had really betrayed the ideals of the Revolution. His party would return to them. But in fact, y'all, Jefferson turned out to be a pretty moderate guy. Okay. He kept a lot of the ideas. Once again, the Revolution is remarkable because it's a peaceful transfer of power. You didn't have barricades. You didn't have battles like in Europe. The losing party accepted the result and gave up their seats. Adams gets revenge later. He nominates these Federalist judges. They would serve for life.
So at 1:54 in 1 minute, please release your students to 7th period. Each will be going to 7th period at 1:54.
All right, and with that, y'all, we can just say,
that's all, folks.
See y'all. we have to shut this off.